Hello and welcome back to the channel. I am the Wandering Griot, and today I have the honor of possibly introducing you to one of the underrated gems of the fantasy genre. And of course, as you can tell by the title, I am talking about Imaro by Charles Saunders. So, out of curiosity, in the comments down below, I want y'all to let me know how many of you are a fan of the original Conan the Barbarian movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Because for me, even to this day, that is still one of my favorite movies. Like, I understand that it's, maybe not the best quality in terms of filmmaking, storytelling, but there is just something so endearing about the character of Conan the Barbarian, as played by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Something that just calls to the adventurous spirit within a person. Now, it was sometime after seeing those films that I began to read the old Conan the Barbarian stories by Robert E. Howard. And I have to say, I fell in love with that black-haired, sullen-eyed reaver from Sumeria called Conan the Barbarian. I think it might have had something to do with the fact that I started reading those stories when I was a teenager. In fact, I enjoyed those stories so much that it made me want to write characters very much in the vein of Conan of Sumeria. And as it would turn out, I am far from the only person who was similarly inspired by the works of Robert E. Howard. Imaro is the first book to be published in what is called the Sword and Soul genre. That, of course, being a play on the words sword and sorcery. That being a genre that focuses specifically on the more adventurous and action-oriented side of fantasy. Think of it as like the 80s action movie of the fantasy genre as a whole. That being said, Sword and Soul is taking that concept of adventure, heavy action, brave warriors, and evil magicians, and placing it in an African-inspired setting. Imaro, written by Charles Saunders, was first published in 1981. It follows the story of an outcast and warrior called Imaro. Imaro is a child of the nomadic warrior tribe called the Iliasai. Even at a young age, Imaro stood out from the rest of the Iliasai, being that he was much more physically imposing than any of his fellow tribe members. As he grew older, he quickly became one of the Iliasai's best warriors, despite still not being fully accepted by the tribe, due to the fact that though his mother was Iliasai, his father comes from a different tribe altogether. Imaro overcomes many challenges in order to prove himself to Iliasai and finally gain their affection. This culminates with his first clash against an evil sorcerer, which leads Imaro to have a dislike for all wielders of magic. Eventually, Imaro decides to leave the Iliasai behind and ventures out into the wider world, where he quickly gains fame and infamy as a deadly warrior and capable leader. As someone who enjoys the study of African history, one of the things I like to do while reading books inspired by African history and mythology is to try and pick out the references to real-world cultures and history in African-inspired fantasy books. The greater content of Africa, as we know, is quite large and quite diverse. So whenever someone mentions African-inspired fantasy, that does not necessarily give any details as to which specific cultures the author is drawing inspiration from. So, what I would like to do is to speculate as to which culture specifically Charles Saunders used when crafting the world of Imaro. For me, it is clear that the region of Africa that Charles Saunders chose to borrow from specifically is East Africa. When the story starts, Imaro is in an isolated portion of the world, and while there, the only culture that we're really exposed to is that of the Iliasai, whom I believe is inspired by certain nomadic tribes of East Africa, such as the Maasai, for example. Evidence of this can be seen in the weapons used by the Iliasai, one of which being the simi, which is a type of short sword or dagger used primarily by the Maasai of East Africa. Another clue is the language used to describe certain animals within this portion of the story. For example, when speaking of a leopard, Imaro refers to it as Chewy. Similarly, instead of saying lion, he would instead call the creature Ingatun. Both of these words come from East African languages, Swahili and Maasai, respectively. The kingdoms and cities of Imaro are reminiscent of those of the Swahili city-states on the eastern coast of Africa, as well as sharing some relative similarities with the Shona peoples and their culture. The magic and more fantastical elements of the story are written in a similar way to most classical fantasies, meaning that it is very different from how it is typically done in the modern era, where the author would create a magic system with very strict rules. Instead, here the magic is very vague and not easily defined. This works very well with the story that is being crafted here, because very often Imaro finds himself on the opposite side of whatever magic is being worked. Therefore, not having a full grasp on the limits of the magic of this world goes a long way in making Imaro, who is, by all rights, superhuman, it goes a long way to make him feel vulnerable in the face of this terrifying, unknowable source of power. Imaro is written in a very straightforward manner. And if you are familiar with Sword and Sorcery by any means, you would know that this is rather typical of the genre. If you are a person that requires fanciful prose or poetic language, then you are certainly in the wrong place. Now, with that being said, that is by no means to discredit the book or say that it is less than any other works of fantasy, because I find that when a story or book knows what it is and is able to bend its entire creative force towards that single ideal, that is when it tends to work the best. And that's exactly what happens here in Imaro. The story is fast paced and action heavy, with the right amount of breaks necessary to get us invested in the characters and care about them emotionally. The action is written well, the descriptions being clear without the scenes becoming too jumbled and confused, and it is able to instill the right amount of enjoyment in the reader in order for us to become fully immersed in the action. Overall, what Charles Saunders is able to do with this novel is fully capture the spirit and essence of the sword and sorcery genre, polish it, and deliver it in a tight, and neatly crafted package. So, if you're a fan of the sword and sorcery genre, or perhaps you're looking for something new, perhaps something faster paced, then I could make no better recommendation than Imaro by Charles Saunders. So, guys, I'd like to thank you once again for sharing your time with me. And if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. And please, return in the future to share more stories from the Wandering Griot.